Good afternoon, folks. Hope you're doing well. And a good afternoon. Let's see who's joined us here. Shall we? What's going on? There we go. Okay. So, good afternoon to who we got? Jackie, Laura, Terry, Kathleen, Teresa. Lots of prayer hands. Rose. Okay. Got the prayer hands going. What we're going to do. Good afternoon, everybody. It's me, Father Scott, your pastor, coming to you live, unless you're watching this not live, from my office. There's some projects from college up above my head, in case you're wondering. So, what have we been doing? What are we doing? We are making our way through. We're going to talk about the Eucharistic prayers. And yesterday we walked through the Mass and how this missal is used during the Mass. It's a Roman missal, okay? And so we walked through all the pieces of it, but we're going to drill down and focus on the Eucharistic prayers. Now, there are four main Eucharistic prayers. And today I want to talk a little bit about the history. Okay? So, the first post-resurrection Mass was when? It was the road to Emmaus, right? They're walking along. Jesus comes up and connects with them. They're down, feeling down because Jesus had died on the cross, even though they had heard about the resurrection, but they're like still a little down because his messiahship wasn't what they were thinking it was going to be. He talks to them. He speaks to them scripture, and then he explains the scripture to them. And then they ask him to stay with them. Again, we're tracking with Mass so far, right? They give him the gifts of the bread. He takes it, he blesses, breaks, and offers it to them. And in that, they recognize him as he disappears from them, but he's present there in the Eucharist that he just confected in front of their eyes. And then they go off to tell other people. They are sent. The Mass ends and they're sent to proclaim the gospel. And that's the first Mass. From that point forward, the Church starts to celebrate the Mass. We hear in the Acts of the Apostles that they came together for the breaking of the bread. That is code for Mass. It's code for the Eucharist. Okay? And from the beginning, the Church celebrates the Mass. But obviously, Jesus didn't say, okay, first I want you to have the priest walk in from the back, and you're going to have an opening song, and everybody's going to be standing in their pews, and they're going to pull out their books. And then he's going to get up there, he's going to kiss the altar, and then you're going to do the penitential rite after the greeting. And then there'll be the opening prayer after the Gloria, and then we'll sit down for readings. Jesus didn't lay out step by step what the Mass was exactly going to look like, right? But By the end of the first century, and really, definitely for sure, by the middle of the second century, Mass as we know it was pretty well nailed down in terms of the structure of the Mass. Saint Justin the Martyr, his quote from 155 is like, it. When I first heard it, it blew my tiny little mind away. Like, wow. The Mass was there way early in the church, and not just like some semblance of the Mass, like the Mass as we know it was there. But you have a couple things going on. First, you have various churches that form, right? Even though Peter's the first pope, Peter goes to Rome, it did take a little while for the church to understand like that Rome's the new seat. Like Rome is the heart of the church, and all the church should be in union with Rome. You have churches rise up in Antioch. You have churches that rise up in Greece, down in Egypt, in parts of Israel. And they're not like, hey, we're the church, you're not the church. But they're just like, in a lot of cases, an apostle comes by and he starts the church. And he gives them the basics. And they start to celebrate. And they start to celebrate the Eucharist. And as they do that, again, they're not looking at Scripture and Jesus is going, okay, do this, and this is what the prayer is going to look like, la, la, la. Parts of the Mass are pulled straight from Scripture, so it's not like it's scriptureless. In fact, it's super scriptural. And the book of Revelation, lots of Scripture there. But, it's not like word for word laid out. And so these different churches are kind of forming the Eucharistic prayers as they go. Well, the seat of the Latin church, the Western church, is Rome. And so you have a canon, you have anaphora is one of the names for it, but basically a Eucharistic prayer that gets developed in Rome. And it is, by 400 AD, it's pretty well set. And there's a little bit of addition that happens in the 5th century, and things get moved around a little bit. But that one Eucharistic prayer, which we call Eucharistic Prayer 1 or the Roman canon, is this essentially what is used by the Western Church for 1,600 years, at least 1,500. And the early church actually was not, they didn't speak Latin necessarily. They, they were Greek. Even though there was Latin in Israel, the language of those that weren't Jewish tended to be Greek. And so the early church did a lot of things in Greek. In fact, Eucharistia, the Eucharist, that's a Greek term. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, that's Greek. So the Mass is being celebrated oftentimes in Greek. But you see the popes slowly start to take on Latin as Greek kind of fades as a universal language. And by the middle to the end of the 3rd century, the popes are starting to do it just, their letters are in Latin. And in the 3rd century, St. Jerome is asked by the Pope to translate the Bible into Latin because it's becoming clear that that is the language of the church. So that means that the Roman canon is translated, any parts of it that were in Greek, now it's all in Latin. And there's some things that are unique to it, especially like the listing of saints that happens, which when we talk about it, I'll probably tell that story. But like, yeah, and those are Roman saints. And when we get further into the history, we'll talk about what that means. But this canon is, again, essentially developed and locked into place by about 400 to the middle of the 5th century. And that is what is used until the 1960s. The one change, if I have my history correct, the one change that happened in the last, basically from like 500 to the mid 20th century, was at one point Joseph was added, the name of Joseph, which Pope Francis added Joseph to the other 3 Eucharistic prayers a few years ago. And we should be excited about that. That's our patron. That's our guy. And this is the year of St. Joseph. So I think we'll probably do some afternoon reflections on the life of St. Joseph. We're gonna live it up this year. Okay, anyway, back to the Eucharistic prayer. So this Roman canon is used 1600 years. It's a beautiful canon. But it has a different structure. It doesn't always necessarily flow logically. And, the truth is, for all of that time, priests are celebrating it in Latin. And as time goes on, I think that the understanding that priests had of the Latin probably went down a little bit. I mean, they knew how to say the Mass, they knew how to pray all the prayers in Latin, but whether or not they truly understood like the nuances and the ins and outs of what the Latin was, that could be questioned. Not to say that they didn't know what they were praying. They knew what they were praying, and they knew what was happening. But again, those nuances of a language that isn't your first. There's plenty of things in sign language that I'm clueless to, right? So when the canon is translated into the vernacular, meaning the language of the region, I'm sure that there were some realizations from priests and from others who had just always heard it in the Latin, knew the responses, knew all of that, but maybe weren't always able to go deep into it. They learned a lot, and it became clear like that it was put together in an interesting way. Like things were not necessarily structured as though it was from the beginning. Okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this. It's a prayer that grew throughout time, and so it grew organically, and things are laid out more organically. There's not like a overall structure that got superimposed at the beginning. It kind of took on its shape as it did. Okay. So because of that, and because you have these saints, these listing of saints that have a lot of reference just to saints from Rome, though we all know the saints. When Vatican II comes along, and it's clear that there are going to be adaptations and changes made to the liturgy, to the Mass, there's a movement to say, can we make some changes to the Eucharistic prayers? And it's a complicated history, and I admittedly didn't know it really well until yesterday. I read up on it, and even now I wouldn't be able to be an expert on it. And you don't probably need to know all the ins and outs, but here's some just basic things. The Vatican II documents, even the document on the liturgy, doesn't say we should change the Eucharistic prayer or that we should add any. That's not laid out there. But as the Mass now is moving into the vernacular, they set up these councils, these committees, to start looking at, okay, what needs to be adjusted and adapted. And those committees also kind of are starting to be encountering different regions that are doing their own sort of experimentation with the Mass, for better or for worse. And one of the experimentations is writing a bunch of new Eucharistic prayers. I think it was the Netherlands, maybe. They wrote several different ones, and they kind of proposed them like, hey, can we add this? France, there were like 200 different ones. I mean, in the time after the council, there was a lot of experimentation going on, and a lot of like, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? Which is understandable, okay? But the Church, the Vatican, had to be like, okay, we need to try to get our hands around this. Are we going to allow more than one Eucharistic prayer? And if so, is it just a couple of them, or is it a wide spectrum, and we let each region just kind of come up with their own, all within reason? So through some machinations and everything like that, essentially, we have the three others that we use now. So you have Eucharistic Prayer 1, the Roman canon, that's been around for 1,600 years. You have Eucharistic Prayer 2, which was written by Hippolytus. So it was, during the early church when they're kind of trying to develop what is the Eucharistic prayer. This was one that Hippolytus would have used, and it kind of kept its, even though Eucharistic Prayer 1 was the only one used for 1,600 years, I think there was an affinity for at least the theology and the structure of the one from Hippolytus. So the Church, again, through various machinations, embraces this Eucharistic prayer from Hippolytus, and that becomes Eucharistic Prayer 2. And then there's this priest called Father Vagagnini, or Vagagnani. Let me try that again. Vagagnini. Whatever. He taught at the Angelicum in Rome, and he set out to offer a couple of other texts, other Eucharistic prayers. And the committee that was tasked with some of these adjustments to the Mass kind of took it upon themselves to make suggestions about which Eucharistic prayers the Vatican, the CDF, the Pope should embrace. And in the end, the one from Hippolytus becomes Eucharistic Prayer 2, and the two written by Father Vagagnini, that priest, it become 3 and 4. Okay, so we're going to talk about the differences that we see, okay? But you have, of these new ones, you've got a short one, Eucharistic Prayer 2, which is one of those that a lot of us probably know a lot of it by heart, because we hear that one the most. Then you have Eucharistic Prayer 3, which is kind of medium length. And then you've got one Eucharistic Prayer 4, which gives like a summary of the entire economy of salvation history. But it has a preface that's particular to it. And so it can only be used really in ordinary time on weekdays when there aren't any saints. So it's pretty limited on how often you're going to hear Eucharistic prayer 4. And that's kind of how we got to where we are today, having the 4 prayers that we do. There was certainly a lot of controversy that went around adding anything. And the church, I think, was wise in saying, hey, if we're going to add some, fine, but we're not going to change the Roman canon, Eucharistic prayer 1. We're not changing it. Even though the structure maybe could be adjusted to be a little more logical, we're not going to. And so we have Eucharistic prayer 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what I'm going to be doing in the upcoming days and weeks is walking through those. So we'll start with Eucharistic prayer 1, and we're going to mine it for the great theology and the great images and what it teaches us, so that when you hear it, it can be more prayerful for you. And then we'll go on to 2, 3, and 4. How's that sound? You okay with that? Sure hope so, because that's what I'm going to do. So with that, I'm going to let you go. I hope you have a great weekend. Adoration today, unfortunately, stops at 5 because of the wedding rehearsal. But we'll have Mass tomorrow at 8:15, confessions at 3:30, Mass at 5, 7:30, 9:30, 11:30. All 4 of those Masses still have some room. And they, especially the 7:30 and 11:30, if you come, there's probably going to be space. So don't stay awake. Come to Mass. We'll have the Rosary tonight at 8, again tomorrow night at 8, and we'll have adoration from 1 to 6 on Sunday. You guys are great.